The girl's hands moved in desperate silence, signing words that fell into the void of her father's indifference. Thomas McBride watched from across the dusty trading post, his coffee growing cold as the scene unfolded with sickening inevitability. "She's strong," Jeremiah Watts was saying, his weathered hand gripping his daughter's shoulder like she was livestock. "Can work harder than most boys, never complains 'cause she can't hear herself whine." The horse trader, a thick-set man named Briggs, circled the girl with calculating eyes. She couldn't have been more than 16, her dress patched but clean, her dark hair braided with the kind of care that spoke of a mother's absent hands. When Briggs reached toward her face, she flinched, but didn't cry out. Couldn't cry out. "Teeth look good," Briggs muttered. "Arms are solid. But she's damaged goods, Watts. A deaf wife ain't worth much to most men." "She ain't for marryin'," Watts spat. "She's for workin', and she'll work herself to death before she'll cause trouble." Thomas's grip tightened around his cup until his knuckles went white. He'd seen plenty of cruelty in his 43 years. Men shot over cards, women abandoned with children, families torn apart by drought and debt. But there was something about the girl's silent dignity that cut through his usual armor of practical detachment. "Hold on there, Briggs." The trading post fell silent, except for the creak of floorboards and the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas rose slowly, chair legs scraping against wood, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he approached, the girl's eyes tracked him with the wary intelligence of a cornered animal calculating escape routes, but also something else. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face with an intensity that suggested she'd learned to read souls through expressions alone. "I've got a better offer." Briggs frowned. "This ain't your concern, McBride." "Maybe not," Thomas said, his eyes fixed on Watts. "But I'm making it my concern. How much do you want for the girl?" Watts laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "She ain't for sale to you, McBride. Briggs here's got plans for her, and they don't involve charity." "I didn't ask about Briggs. I asked about you." Thomas's voice dropped lower, the kind of quiet that made smart men nervous. He pulled out his leather wallet, fingers steady despite the rage coiling in his gut. "Name your price." The girl's head snapped toward him, and he caught something that made his breath catch. She was reading his lips. Not just watching, but understanding. Her eyes moved from his mouth to his hands to his face, mapping his intentions with the fierce concentration of someone who'd survived by becoming fluent in the language of other people's moods. "You serious?" Watts asked, his voice taking on the wheeling tone of a man sensing opportunity. "Dead serious." Briggs stepped forward, his thick frame blocking the morning light, fists clenching and unclenching. "Now wait just a minute. I already made a deal with a man who doesn't own what he's selling." Thomas shifted his weight, shoulders squaring, the movement subtle but unmistakable. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd faced down rustlers and drought without flinching. "Last I checked, people can't be bought and sold in this territory, least not legally." "She's my daughter," Watts protested, spittle flying, his face flushing red as he jabbed a finger toward Thomas's chest. "I got every right." "You got the right to be her father. You don't got the right to sell her like livestock." The words came out measured, deliberate, each one landing like a hammer blow. The silence stretched taut like barbed wire. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through grimy windows. The smell of leather and tobacco hung heavy in the air, mixed with something else. The sharp scent of fear sweat from Watts, the metallic tang of Thomas's own adrenaline. Through the window, he could see his foreman, Jake, shifting restlessly by the wagon, probably sensing trouble on the wind. $500, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Watts's Adam's apple bobbed. Briggs's face went slack. The girl's lips parted in a silent gasp, her hand flying to her throat as if she could still breathe. When she looked at Thomas again, her eyes held something that nearly undid him. Not just gratitude, but recognition. As if she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to see her as more than damaged goods, and had almost given up believing that person existed. 500? Watts whispered. Cash money? Cash money. Thomas opened his wallet and counted out bills that represented months of careful savings, years of denied comforts, the security he'd built $1 at a time. For her freedom, not her servitude. She comes with me as a free person, not property. The girl's hands moved again, signing something he couldn't understand. But her expression spoke clearly enough. Gratitude mixed with disbelief, hope tempered by a lifetime of disappointment. Watts grabbed for the money with shaking hands. Deal. The ride back to the double bar passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip of hooves against packed earth. Thomas kept his eyes on the road ahead, acutely aware of the girl sitting rigid beside him on the wagon seat. She hadn't made a sound since leaving the trading post. Couldn't, he reminded himself, but her presence filled the space between them like a held breath. Jake rode alongside, shooting curious glances that Thomas ignored. His foreman had worked for him long enough to know when questions weren't welcome, but Thomas could feel the weight of unasked words hanging in the air like smoke. What the hell had he done? $500. The number carved itself deeper into his consciousness with each mile. That money was supposed to buy breeding stock for next season, repair the north fence line, maybe even add that room to the house he'd been planning for 3 years. Instead, he'd handed it over to a man who'd sell his own daughter for horseflesh. The girl shifted beside him, and he caught a glimpse of her hands moving in her lap. Quick, nervous gestures that looked like prayer or maybe conversation with invisible companions. When she noticed him watching, her hands stilled instantly, color rising in her cheeks. "You don't have to stop," he said, then felt foolish. She couldn't hear me. But she was watching his face again with that intense focus, reading something in his expression that made her hands resume their quiet motion. This time, when he glanced over, she didn't stop. Her movements were fluid, graceful. A language he'd never seen but somehow understood was beautiful. The double bar spread out before them as they crested the final hill. 5,000 acres of good grazing land carved from Texas wilderness through 15 years of back-breaking work. The main house sat solid and square in a grove of cottonwoods, its wraparound porch and red tile roof speaking of prosperity earned, not inherited. Outbuildings dotted the landscape: barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, corrals that held some of the finest horses in 3 counties. It was everything Thomas had ever wanted, everything he'd built with his own hands and the sweat of honest work. And he'd just mortgaged its future for a girl whose name he didn't even know. Jake pulled his horse alongside the wagon as they rolled into the yard. "Boss, you want to tell me what's going on?" Thomas set the brake and climbed down, his joints protesting after the long ride. Around the yard, ranch hands paused in their work to stare. Cookie emerged from the bunkhouse kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. Even the dogs seemed curious, tails wagging but heads tilted in question. "This is—" Thomas paused, realizing he'd never gotten her name. He turned to the wagon where she sat frozen, overwhelmed by all the watching eyes. She was terrified. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever hope he'd seen in her face at the trading post had been buried under the crushing weight of uncertainty. She was death, alone, surrounded by strange men on an unfamiliar ranch, completely dependent on the questionable mercy of a man who'd bought her freedom for reasons she couldn't possibly understand. Thomas stepped closer to the wagon, moving slowly, deliberately. When he was close enough that she could see his face clearly, he spoke, making sure his lips were visible. "What's your name?" She blinked, then raised her hands tentatively. Her fingers moved in careful, deliberate patterns, spelling something out, letter by letter. Thomas frowned,
trying to follow, when Cookie spoke up from behind him. "She's spelling Grace," the old cook said quietly. "My sister was born deaf. I know some of the hand talk." Grace. The name settled into his chest like a missing piece finding its place. He nodded at her, then gestured toward the house. "You'll stay in the main house," he said, speaking clearly so she could read his lips. "Cookie will show you where everything is."
Her eyes went wide with something like panic, and her hands moved frantically. Cookie stepped forward, his own weathered hands responding in the same silent language. After a moment of rapid exchange, he turned to Thomas. "She says she can work, doesn't want charity, asks what her duties will be." Thomas felt something twist in his gut. Even now, even after everything, she expected to be property, just owned by someone kinder than her father. "No duties," he said firmly, making sure she could see every word. "You're free. You can stay as long as you want. Leave whenever you choose. This is your home now, not your workplace." Cookie translated, his hands moving with surprising grace for someone who spent his days wielding cast-iron skillets. Grace's response was immediate and emphatic, her gestures sharp with emotion. "She says she has to earn her keep, says she won't be a burden, wants to know what kind of work needs doing." Around the yard, Thomas could feel his men watching, judging, waiting to see how his boss handled this unprecedented situation. He'd built the double bar on clear principles: hard work, fair treatment, earned respect. But Grace didn't fit into any category he'd ever dealt with. The afternoon sun slanted lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Grace sat in the wagon like a statue, every muscle tense with the effort of holding herself together. Thomas could see her fighting tears, see the way her hands trembled despite her attempt at composure. Decision crystallized in his mind with the clarity of fresh water. "Cookie," he said, without taking his eyes off Grace. "Show her to the guest room. Make sure she has everything she needs: hot water, clean clothes, a good meal. Tomorrow, we'll figure out how she wants to help around here." He stepped closer to the wagon again, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, the small scar on her chin that spoke of childhood accidents, and the way her lips pressed together when she was trying not to cry. "Grace." He said her name carefully, watching recognition flicker across her face. "You're safe here. I give you my word." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. When Cookie offered his hand to help her down from the wagon, she took it with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to accept help without surrendering pride. As they walked toward the house, Thomas caught Jake's questioning look. "Not a word, Thomas," he said quietly. "Not one damn word." But Jake was grinning. "Wouldn't dream of it, boss. Though I gotta say, that's the most expensive act of Christian charity I've ever seen." Thomas watched Grace disappear into his house. Their house now, he supposed, and felt the full weight of what he'd done settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. $500 and a death girl who spelled her name in the air like a prayer. What the hell was he going to do now?
3 weeks passed before Thomas realized he was looking forward to breakfast. It started small, Grace appearing in the kitchen before dawn, working alongside Cookie with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to read the rhythms of a household through observation rather than instruction. She never asked for anything, never complained about the men's rough manners or the primitive conditions of ranch life. She simply found what needed doing and did it. The hands had been skeptical at first, suspicious of any change to their routine, but Grace had a way of making herself useful without making herself noticed, mending torn shirts left in the bunkhouse, tending the small vegetable garden behind the main house, keeping the coffee pot filled during long branding sessions. Thomas watched it all from a careful distance, torn between admiration and something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. She was in the garden when the trouble started, kneeling between rows of late tomatoes with her back to the main gate. Thomas saw the riders coming long before she did. 3 men on lathered horses, riding hard and angry. He recognized Jeremiah Watts immediately, along with 2 men he didn't know, but didn't like the look of. Thomas was halfway across the yard when Watts spotted Grace and spurred his horse toward the garden. The sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth should have warned her, but she was lost in her silent world, focused on the simple task of pulling weeds. "Grace!" Thomas shouted, knowing she couldn't hear but hoping she might feel the urgency in his voice somehow. She looked up just as Watts's horse thundered into the garden, scattering tomato plants and sending her scrambling backward on hands and knees. Watts was off his horse before the animal had fully stopped, his face twisted with rage and something Thomas recognized as desperation. "You got no right," Watts snarled, advancing on Thomas with fists clenched. "She's my blood, my daughter. You can't just steal her." Thomas stepped between Watts and Grace, who had pressed herself against the garden fence like a cornered animal. Her hands were moving frantically, not signing, just clutching at her skirt with white-knuckled terror. "I didn't steal anything," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. "I bought her freedom from a man who was selling his own child like livestock. That money's spent, gone to pay debts that would have killed me. But I found out something interesting, McBride. Turns out there's men willing to pay twice what you did for a young, deaf girl. Seems some folks got particular tastes." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Behind Watts, the 2 strangers sat their horses with the patient stillness of men accustomed to violence. Professional men, the kind who did unpleasant work for unpleasant money. "She's not for sale," Thomas said, each word falling like stones into still water. "Everything is for sale, McBride. Question is whether you're smart enough to take my generous offer, or whether we do this the hard way."
From the corner of his eye, Thomas could see his ranch hands drifting closer, Jake emerging from the barn with a rifle in his hands, Cookie stepping onto the porch with a shotgun, others materializing from corrals and outbuildings with the quiet efficiency of men who'd faced trouble together before. But Grace was still trapped against the fence, and Thomas could see her reading the situation in the tense faces around her, understanding with terrible clarity that she was once again the center of a transaction that might be decided with violence. "How much?" Thomas asked quietly. Watts smiled, the expression ugly as a knife wound. $1,000, cash money, and you forget you ever saw her." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. $1,000. More than the ranch usually cleared in a good year, more than he could possibly scrape together without selling everything he'd built. "I need time to raise that kind of money," he said. "You got until sunset. After that, we take her anyway, and you get nothing but a bullet for your trouble." The men rode out in a cloud of dust and threats, leaving Thomas standing in the ruins of Grace's garden with the taste of copper in his mouth. When he turned, Grace was staring at him with eyes that held too much understanding. She'd read his lips. She knew what Watts wanted, knew what was at stake. Her hands moved slowly, spelling out words that Cookie translated in a voice thick with emotion. "She says to let them take her. Says you've done enough, lost enough. Says she won't let you destroy everything for her." Thomas looked at Grace, really looked at her, and saw not a burden or a responsibility, but a woman who'd found a moment of peace in his garden and was willing to sacrifice it to save him from his own conscience. The realization hit him like lightning splitting oak. "Cookie," Thomas said without taking his eyes off Grace, "send Jake to town. Tell him to talk to Harrison at the bank about a loan against the ranch." "Boss!" "Do it." Thomas stepped closer to Grace, close enough that his voice would carry clearly to her. "I'm not letting you take you. Not today, not ever." Her hands moved again, more urgently. "She says the ranch is your life's work.
says she's not worth it." Thomas reached out slowly, carefully, and caught her hands in his. The first time he'd touched her since helping her down from the wagon 3 weeks ago. Her fingers were small in his, calloused from garden work, trembling with emotion. "Grace," he said, making sure she could see every word, feel the truth of them in the steady pressure of his hands around hers. "I'm not letting them take you." The tears came then, silent and unstoppable, tracking down her cheeks as she looked into his face and saw something there that made her hands still, made her breathing catch. Sunset was still hours away, but Thomas McBride had already made his choice. The only question now was whether he'd live long enough to see it through.
The bank in Millerville had never seen a loan request like Thomas McBride's. "You want to mortgage the double bar," Samuel Harrison repeated slowly, "for $1,000 cash, to be paid today, to buy a girl's freedom from men who aren't legally entitled to sell her?" Thomas sat across from the banker's oak desk, hat in his hands, trying to find words that would make sense of what he was asking. Through the window, he could see Jake pacing nervously in the street, rifle in hand, keeping watch for Watts and his hired guns. "That's about the size of it," Thomas said. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, studying Thomas with the calculating gaze of a man who'd learned to measure risk in human faces. "Tom, I've known you for 15 years. You've never made a foolish decision in your life. Your ranch is the most profitable operation in 3 counties. But this is different," Thomas finished. "Different how?" Thomas struggled with the answer. How could he explain that Grace's silent presence had changed something fundamental in the rhythm of his days? That her careful attention to small kindnesses, fresh flowers by his plate, his favorite shirt mended without being asked, the way she smiled when she caught him watching her work in the garden, had made him realize how empty his life had been? "She's worth it," he said finally. Harrison sighed and pulled out the loan documents. "Your ranch has collateral. If you default, the bank takes everything: land, buildings, livestock, equipment. You understand that?" "I understand." "And you know that mortgaging for this amount will take you 15 years to pay off, assuming good weather, good prices, and no catastrophes." "I know." Harrison dipped his pen in ink, then paused. "Tom, there's something else you should consider. Word's already spreading about what you did at the trading post. Some folks are calling it noble. Others are saying you've lost your mind over a pretty face. But there's a third group that's saying something different." "What's that?" "They're saying a man who'd bankrupt himself for a deaf girl might be the kind of man who'd stand up for anyone being mistreated. Might be the kind of man worth following if the territory ever needed that kind of leadership." Thomas looked up sharply. "I'm not looking for political office, Sam." "Maybe not, but leadership has a way of finding the right man whether he's looking for it or not." Harrison signed the papers with a flourish. $1,000, Tom. May God help you both." The ride back to the double bar felt like a funeral procession. Thomas carried the money in his saddlebags, more cash than he'd ever held at one time, more than he'd see again for years to come. Jake rode beside him in grim silence, both men knowing that they were probably riding toward a gunfight that would decide more than just Grace's fate. They reached the ranch as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky the color of blood and fire. Watts was waiting in the yard with his hired guns, their horses stamping impatiently in the cooling air. Grace stood on the porch between Cookie and 2 ranch hands, her face pale but composed. "You got my money, McBride?" Watts called out as Thomas dismounted. "I've got it, but I want something in writing this time. A bill of sale that says you're giving up all claim to Grace forever." Watts laughed, but there was nervousness in the sound. "You don't trust me?" "About as far as I can throw your horse." One of the hired guns shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his pistol. Around the yard, Thomas's men tensed, ready for violence. But Watts held up a hand. "Fair enough." He pulled out a crumpled paper and a pencil stub. "One bill of sale, signed and witnessed." Thomas read the document carefully, his lawyer's training from years ago serving him well. When he was satisfied, he nodded. "The money's yours when she's safe in my house." "The money's mine when I say it is," Watts snarled, his patience finally snapping. "Boys?" The hired guns moved fast, but Thomas's men were faster. Jake's rifle boomed, dropping one man from his saddle. Cookie's shotgun roared from the porch, sending the second scrambling for cover. Watts himself drew a pistol with surprising speed, but Thomas was already moving. The two men collided in a tangle of fists and fury, rolling in the dust as gunfire erupted around them. Thomas felt Watts's gun barrel scrape against his ribs, heard the click of a hammer being pulled back. Then, Grace was there. She jumped from the porch during the fight, moving with desperate courage toward the struggling men. As Watts aimed his pistol at Thomas's head, Grace grabbed a broken fence post from the garden and brought it down on Watts's wrist with every ounce of strength in her small frame. The gun flew from Watts's shattered hand as he screamed in pain and rage. Thomas rolled clear, gasping for breath, as Jake appeared with rifle trained on the injured man. "It's over, Watts. Take what's left of your men and get off my land." Watts struggled to his feet, cradling his broken wrist, his face twisted with pain and defeat. "This ain't finished, McBride. There's others who'll come for her, others who know what she's worth." "Let them come," Thomas said quietly. "They'll find the same welcome you did." As Watts and his remaining hired gun rode into the gathering darkness, Thomas turned to Grace. She stood in the yard holding the fence post like a weapon, her dress torn, dirt streaking her face, looking like an avenging angel in the dying light. "Grace," he said, and she turned toward him with eyes that held no fear now, only fierce determination. Her hands moved quickly, and Cookie translated with a grin. "She says next time you should just shoot first and ask questions later." Thomas felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep in his chest, laughter mixed with relief and something that felt dangerously like love. "I'll remember that." As the stars appeared overhead, Thomas looked around his ranch, his mortgaged, debt-ridden, uncertain future, and felt richer than he'd ever been in his life. Grace was free. She was safe. She was home. And for the first time since his parents had died, Thomas McBride wasn't facing the world alone. The double bar would survive. They would rebuild, pay off the debt, make the ranch prosper again. But more than that, they would prove that some things, freedom, dignity, love, were worth any price a man might pay. In the morning, there would be work to do, plans to make, a future to build together. Tonight, that was enough.